In 1953, the 13-year-long marriage between thespians Laurence Olivier and Vivien Leigh majorly cracked. 5 years prior, in 1948, Olivier and Leigh were touring Australia with Richard III. Olivier and Leigh brought not only Shakespeare, but the stories of historic British figures from Lady Hamilton to Elizabeth I into new light. Their devotion to period drama, specifically British period drama, helped raise the profile of British cinema to new heights. Arguably, British period drama remains among the best in the world today, although it is tainted with ethnic replacement and humiliation ritual. The 1591 emotionally taxing play Richard III brought Leigh into contact with Australian actor Peter Finch, and Olivier noticed. His heart focused on the play, he watched and waited, but there was an affair brewing. Finch's devotion to Leigh was such that he inspired his mentee, Trader Faulkner, with it, and Faulkner was still writing about her in his 90s. To provide some background, one can watch the Vivien Leigh breakdown video on this channel. Here is a piece from The Spectator and Where Madness Lies by Lyndsy Spence regarding Vivien Leigh, after which we will read from Laurence Olivier's autobiography regarding one of Leigh's most famous breakdowns. Vivien was barking mad from the word go, Laurence reflected in later life, and Lyndsy Spence's biography fully concurs with that summing up. The actress was suspended in a dream world, unable to separate herself from the classic characters she played, Scarlett O'Hara, with her dark hair and flashing eyes, or Blanche Dubois. She is a tragic figure, and I understand her, she said. At her worst, Leigh was, in her own words, a thing, an amoeba, at the bottom of the sea. Where Madness Lies provides an analysis of her numerous breakdowns when she was in the grip of manic depressive cycles, the high spirits and crushing melancholia, when everything inside her brain was white noise. Spence explores the sensitive subject of mental illness, using Leigh as an opportunity to look at women's health and the complexities of the female mind. Leigh was certainly complex, a beauty who could become demonic. She drank a lot, got puffy. The double Academy Award-winning actress had a reductive view of her performances. She was the harridan who drove Olivier to despair into the arms of Dorothy Tootin, Jean Simmons, and Claire Bloom, but then announced, "I'd rather live a short life with Larry than face a long one without him." She died alone in 1967, aged 53, cradling her jewels like children. Olivier had divorced her 7 years previously. Had India, with its rampant abuse of children, the child prostitutes of Calcutta ongoing today, unhinged her? Leigh was born in Darjeeling in 1913, and something of the tropical heat, monsoon and dry seasons, humidity, and typhoid outbreaks seeped into her temperament. Flower-scented gardens, glass beads, incense, contagious fogs, tarantulas on the lawn, everything in her childhood seemed in a perfumed haze, as heavy as a storm cloud. Her mother, Gertrude, was mixed race, and when this was revealed, her husband, Ernest, who trained horses for the Indian Cavalry Corps, was drummed out of the Bengal Club, which prohibited its members from having wives of a different race. Leigh's father's family ran a pub in Pontefract, and there was also Catholic Irish heritage. At the age of 6, Leigh left India for the Convent of the Sacred Heart in Roehampton. Here she had to undress in the dark and wear a linen shift. It felt like a shroud in the bathtub, as the body had to be concealed. This was a total shift from India, with its naked children running about in gutters. Supposedly, Leigh expected to have sex with her partner 4 times a day. As Peter Finch conceded, after you've been to bed with Vivien, nothing else mattered. Olivier, too, was besotted. Though Vivien married a lawyer, Leigh Holman, in 1932, Leigh grew restless in the marriage. Olivier was dissatisfied with his wife, Jill Esmond, with whom he calculated he'd only slept with 7 times. He cheated on her, which you can learn about on this channel, and he was resentful of the lifelong alimony he was compelled to pay. "I was only half alive before I met Vivien," said Olivier. After a performance as Lady Macbeth or Cleopatra, Vivien was like an animal released from its cage, strong-willed, unbending. She often flew into a blind rage, was suspicious and paranoid. Upon her was not only the pressure to revive the London stage, so dead with so many dead in the trenches of World War I, which she did with the Old Vic and its transfer into semi-government hands, but to have children. She ended up miscarrying several times during her 20-year marriage to Olivier. On an airplane, she screamed a wing was on fire and threatened to throw herself out. Making Gone with the Wind in 1939, she was found in her living room, half dead from taking 4 sleeping pills, staggering around naked and collapsing over furniture. Was it the Selznick's refusal to pay her more than 20 grand for the entire movie that brought about this lapse? She hallucinated trees were women dressed in ball gowns. In Zagreb, she tore off all her clothes in a park, jumped on and off trains, and made a speech at a civic reception saying, "I think this is the most boring evening I have ever had in my life." The audience applauded anyway. When she had her affair with Finch, she kept calling him by her husband's name, pleading with him to sleep with her. When Finch was later in bed with his wife, Tamra, Leigh stormed in, screaming obscenities at both of them. According to author Spence, Leigh asked Finch, "How could you be sleeping with her, you monster? You're my lover." She chased Tamra with a kitchen knife, then threw herself out the window, a gesture because they were just in a 1-story bungalow. Leigh was eventually committed to Netherne Asylum of Surrey, and later to the Avenue Nursing Home in St. John's Wood, where she tried to bite the nurses and doctors. She was wrapped in cold, wet bedsheets, plunged into ice baths, and given shock therapy, which burnt her temples and scorched her hair, making her wear wigs thereafter. None of this did any lasting good. Leigh was always flitting from darkness to light and perishing in the process, scrubbing floors, she was never satisfied with them and repeated, or else hurling herself against walls like a poor maddened bird. She was replaced in the film Elephant Walk by Elizabeth Taylor, the Jewish studio darling who pushed out the lost Gentile Marilyn Monroe, arguably to her death, though Leigh can still be seen in the long shots filmed on location in Sri Lanka. On a post-tour war tour of Australia, she and Olivia kept hitting each other backstage or at airports, a passionate display exacerbated by the strain of acting opposite each other in Shakespeare. "I didn't think I could keep up with him," Leigh confessed, alluding to the mismatch in their styles. Another factor affecting her mental instability was her inability to have children with Olivier. Not that she was cut out for motherhood, possessing very few qualities of restfulness, let alone patience. Olivier, for his part, loved their home of Notley Abbey, and did not seem particularly desiring of another child after his son Tarquin, born in his first marriage. Vivien had a daughter, Suzanne, with her first husband in 1933, but she felt hopeless when Suzanne cried, and was at a loss to comfort her, and often forgot her birthday. The number of miscarriages and stillbirths was traumatic, including one during Caesar and Cleopatra of 1945. Leigh had a maternity wardrobe designed by Balmain standing by. It was a sign of her deep disturbance and jealousy that she'd rip up photos of other people's children if she found them. So you'd find her sobbing, chain-smoking, and wringing her hands. Despite creating the role of the young actress in Terence Rattigan's play The Sleeping Prince, Leigh wasn't chosen for the film version, The Prince and the Showgirl. Marilyn Monroe was cast instead, whom Olivier called a spoilt, contaminated fat slug, but repented later in life and acknowledged she was an actor for the screen, while he was more an actor for the theater. Olivier could find no role for his wife in The Entertainer, where he began his relationship with Joan Plowright, whom he would later marry. It is sad to read the longer Larry stayed away, the more Leigh believed he would return to her. After the couple divorced in 1960, Leigh succumbed to pleurisy and chronic pulmonary tuberculosis, which she had her whole life, which weakened her voice and left her short of breath. She had a partner of sorts, Jack Merivale, whom she treated as her butler, but still expected to be addressed formally as Lady Olivier. She never fulfilled her promise to friends to retire to Corfu and paint landscapes. If ever there was a flawed masterpiece, it was Vivien, said Peter Finch. Now we turn to Olivier's autobiography and recollection of 1953. For a while I had a small but growing sense of worry. Vivien, who had always chosen her work carefully and wisely, recently became enthusiastic about an idea for a job which I felt to be a most unwise choice, an undistinguished melodrama to be located in Ceylon, and shot at the end of January 1953. The producers suggested I might consider taking the male lead opposite her in the film. Vivien asked, was I sure I wouldn't like to? It was a safe enough question, I realized, knowing as she did that not only was I against the project, but also I had ahead of me the 16 weeks needed by any producer for editing, post-syncing, scoring, dubbing, final color matching, titling, and negative cutting of the Beggar's Opera. When almost without pause, she said in that case none other than Peter Finch would be the leading man. The penny dropped, and it dropped with the knell of a high-pitched chapel bell. I was allowed onto the tarmac at the airport, and as the plane began to move forward, they both looked back at me through the window. Peter making a gallant effort to look the protective friend, and she, with a little smile of infinite sweetness, blowing me a sad little kiss. I turned away and drove back to London in a state of nothingness to pick up the relatively light cudgels of finishing off a picture. I saw to things at home, my beloved Notley, which I have sometimes accused myself of loving to excess. I nursed an obsessive, possessive love for it, which sometimes made me feel guilty. It is inhuman, immoral, to love a thing more than people, work, intellect, art, my dead, my friends. I felt I became an eccentric who, having had the love of his life extracted like some rotten tooth, turns all his affections to his dog or some hobby. Notley Abbey had been founded and built by Walter Gifford, Earl of Buckingham, during the reign of Henry II, in order that the souls of the king, his queen Eleanor of Aquitaine, his own soul, and those of his own family might be prayed for in perpetuity. What a wonderfully simple way of bargaining with God. 2 weeks of comparative peace served to give me time with my loved friends again, always there, ready to talk or stay mute as need be. It seemed hardly 2 minutes before my peace was shattered. Irving Asher, a friend of long standing and producer of the film being made in Ceylon, called Cecil Tennant in a state of great panic. Vivien's conduct was making the work on the film impossible. She showed no vestige of her habitual discipline and was impossible to reason with. Could I come over and do something? I was anxious to see the state of the Union for myself, and so, knowing the hopelessness of my quest, I got limply onto a comet and flew from Paris as directly as you then could. Vivien met me at the airport, which dismayed me a bit because I was sure she should have been in front of the cameras. She was all for stopping off at a rest house, a name so delightfully vague. She was insistent upon needing a little drink and a relax, but I said we should really get her back to work as soon as we could, since we surely didn't want to worry them unnecessarily. This was met with a blaze of rage that surprised even me. In the unhappy colloquy that followed, I thought ruefully of the wretched waste of time, effort, and money I had been a party to. It was a long drive, but at last we got to the hotel in Candy. I found there Peter Finch was very much in charge, being the only person who had any kind of influence upon Vivien. To do him justice, he used that influence as best he could in the film's interests, but the governing factor of the situation was the two of them were helplessly lost in the flood tide of the all-consuming passion for which, for the first time, they were giving enthusiastic license. Ethel, Vivien's maid, upset and distracted with terror, told me so far they had not been to bed, but had lain together all night in the open on hillsides. I could find no blame in my heart for Peter. Was he not simply doing what I had done to her first husband 17 years ago? I found it pretty old-fashioned to work up any extra feelings of outrage on account of my being his boss, from whom he had been able to glean a very nice career, thank you. Besides, I always liked him, and in the strangest of ways, just then, the utter confusion of the mess in which we found ourselves seemed to dispel hostility. The humiliation of hanging around Ceylon would have been quite enough to send me packing, without any special application of common sense. My mission had been as futile as any man would have known it would be. I got myself onto a plane after 3 days, and was in Paris. I went straight on home the next day, as I had music sessions for the Beggars' Opera. My situation did not really bear any more thinking about. I managed to insulate my feelings in a soft coat of numbness. Vivien and the film unit started shooting in Hollywood from Ceylon in March 1953, and then my beloved brother was married, for the third and last time, to an angelic girl, Hester, with whom we still keep in close contact, although my brother died more than 20 years ago now. As soon as I completed most of my work, I suddenly had to get away from England. I called up friends in Ischia and asked them to let me stay with them for a little while. When I arrived at their Casa Cirillo, the first of many houses in which they've lived on this magical island, there was a telegram for me. My heart sank. It was telling me to meet with someone called Peter Moore in Naples, and be prepared to return to the United States immediately. I was then on the boat back to Naples, and I shall never forget the color of the sky, blanketed all over with a turbulent cloud. It was dark red. Yes, it was ominous, all right. When I got into Rome, I did some very necessary phoning. Thank God our dear GP, Dr. Armando Child, was at home. Owing to the mental sickness of someone else close to me, I knew about Dr. Freudenberg, head of the Northern Hospital in Colston, and so was able to do a quick bit of programming. Vivien was now in Hollywood, and I went to touch down at Idlewood. Danny Kaye met us and gave us the overall picture. Next was the encounter with Vivien, more dreaded than any other in my life. She had her own house, of course, to live in while making her picture. Cecil and I were staying at David Niven's. David had told me a great deal. I learned how he and other actors had been hearing of goings-on of the most sinister kind. An old flame of Vivien's from the days before she and I had met. His name was John, possibly John Buckmaster, whom you can learn about on this channel, had taken up residence in her house. Barking mad himself, he would lord it about the house, draped in long tunics and togas of towels, taking the most obvious advantage of her, and thereby exacerbating her condition. We decided the rumors were worrying enough to warrant a forced inspection. Having got inside the door, their horrified eyes gazed upwards to see Vivien balancing quite naked upon the rail of the landing. John appeared from the shadows, making the mistake of adopting a friendly manner. My two friends took firm hold of him and made it clear, if ever he attempted to re-enter this house, he would be made to feel sorry for it. When I arrived at this house, I was told I would find her outside on the upstairs balcony. Stepping gently onto this, I saw her. She was leaning with her elbows upon the railing and her face in her hands. I called her softly, and she looked up at me. It was as if her eyes were misted all over, all gray-green blue. only the tiniest pinprick of a pupil was discernible. I said, "Hello, darling," and when she spoke to me it was in the tone of halting, dreamlike amazement that people in the theater use for mad scenes when they can't think of anything better. My instinctive reaction was she was acting. I took her very gently in my arms, not able for the life of me to think of anything to ask beyond did she think perhaps there was something the matter with her. She turned away from the railing towards the wall, and with the wonderment of a first communion said, "I'm in love." I asked very gently, "Who with, darling?" Then, approaching the Most High, "Peter Finch." Where the hell was he, by the way, I wondered. Next day we went to see the Paramount People, and no big motion picture film could possibly have been more kind, understanding, or so generously sympathetic in such circumstances, with not one hint of justifiable grievance or complaint. So we had no problems other than logistical ones. Again, the American top brass authorities were marvelously helpful, cutting through their own red tape with realistic abandon. People are in trouble, then help them, seems to be an American motto as cardinal as e pluribus unum. There were already 2 nurses in residence at Vivien's house. She complained to me in the night she had been woken, strapped up, and wrapped in cold, wet sheets. Horrified by this, I told the nurses they had some explaining to do. They said the most vitally important thing for her condition was sleep. This was unusually difficult, because she exercised an extraordinary willpower in her resistance to succumbing to even those strongest drugs, so having sedated her all they dared, they had recourse to this crude way of inducing sleep. It did not take long for her body warmth to warm the wet sheets, and in the process sleep would overtake her. They would then remove the wet sheets, dry her gently, and wrap her again in warm, dry bedclothes, and she would remain asleep for the rest of the night. Then came the big consultation with Doctors Grotjohn, Greenson, and MacDonald. Dr. Grotjohn was reputed to be the big white chief. The others I was beginning to know quite well. MacDonald was a kindly general practitioner of good reputation. Greenson was the psychiatrist I felt most trusted. The big maestro, Dr. Grotjohn, made one pronouncement in his mid-European accent, at which I nearly laughed out loud. "She must go to her home. You must take her there immediately. It is what she needs. She will recover there wonderfully quickly." He then continued, "She wants her mother." Now, Gertrude adored Vivien, but on Vivien's side I would say there had been no great feeling of need for her mother since she stopped breastfeeding, and in these present circumstances she would as soon have kicked her out her mother as listened to her. This is not an unkind exaggeration. Some time later at home, she gave way to a fit of fury with Gertrude, and tore her breasts, hurting her badly. Gertrude forgave her at once, and never mentioned it again. It was impossible for me ever to be too far away, so I tried to sleep on one bed, with my friend Cecil in his clothes on Vivien's with his arms around her. I think there is nothing in the world so precious as truly selfless friendship. I am aware this is not an original thought, but if it can do nothing else, this book must register this gift as the richest in my unfairly rich cake of a life. If there was one thing of which Vivien was terrified, it was needles, hypodermics of any sort, but the time came when she had to be put out and got onto a plane. Our new nurse appeared with what seemed to be an unusually large needle and a hefty container filled with liquid. Vivien saw them and made a desperate attempt to escape. To my horror, I saw the nurse was enjoying it. She was waggling the syringe in her hand, and there was a glint in her eye. But there was no time for anything. I threw myself on top of Vivien and held her down. Vivien fought us with the utmost ferocity as the needle went in, biting and scratching, screaming appalling abuse, with particular attention to my erotic impulses. It seemed an eternity before she went limp. That night, back in England, she was safe in Nethern Hospital, or Nethern Asylum. Vivien's parents came to dine with me at Durham Cottage. When I told them the whole wretched tale, I remembered I had to ask them if there had been any insanity in either of their families. Ernest, nearly splitting a gut with outrage, almost shouted, "Good God, no!" I had by this time very little patience with those who would insist on making such a distinction between mental and physical illness, and barely managed to bite back, "Well, you have now." Next day I went down to Notley and slept and slept. Wonderful gift that was, a life-saver. 30 years later, I look back with envy. But life and one's ways of adjusting and dealing with it change all the time. I soon wished I had cut off my hand before giving an autograph on the boat from Naples. Within 3 days there wasn't a soul that didn't know I was there. The intense vulnerability of my situation, a wife in a mental home, and I obviously on the run, had made me the object of unusual press interest. My darling friends would not hear of my simply getting the hell out of Italy and going home. But I decided that if I wanted to go out, I had to lie on the floor of the back of my friend's Bentley, covered with a rug. I found Vivien in an altogether changed condition in the London clinic. She found it impossible to understand why I had not been waiting at her bedside for her first stirring while still at Netherne Asylum. I had of course been over-anxious to believe Freudenberg would not allow her to waken before he was satisfied the cure could continue at the rhythm required. We were none of us sufficiently trained in the extra wariness always needed to keep up with the one who was not a sleepy baby. I blamed myself, and I still do, for not being more alive to my duties, no matter how painful or how mortally sick of them I was. It was typical of my friend Noel Coward to be as thoughtful as I had been self-removing, and he had placed by her bed all the things women would most like to find by them at such a waking: flowers, Christian Dior perfume, toilet water, powder, the lot. Vivien never ceased to appreciate this thoughtfulness. Of course I knew she had been given shock treatment, many applications of it. Freudenberg explained to me now what the future was likely to hold: a permanent, though not rhythmically regular series of the downs and ups associated with manic depression. There was as yet no known cure for this condition, which in some cases cured itself spontaneously. But it was much more probable that the sickness was permanent. The major thing was to keep it under reasonable control. This could best be achieved by riding through the depressive stage, then watching very carefully the interim period of apparent normality, and at the first sign of the up, to take the patient, by force if necessary, to be put under the briefest anesthesia, so that the lightning passage of current could be shot from one temple to the other. The doctor explained the patient would wake to a state of calm normality. There was one aspect of this treatment which did cause me anxiety. There is no question that by now such side effects will have been greatly, if not entirely, ironed out. I have not happened on any companion experiences with which to compare notes, but the reservations in my mind were concerned with slight but noticeable personality changes. I can only describe them by saying that she was not, now that she had been given the treatment, the same girl I had fallen in love with. I have said that some 4 years before this her feelings for me changed, and she told me so, but now it was not so much a question of her feelings as my own. She was no longer the person I loved her that much less. She was now more of a stranger to me than I could have ever imagined possible. Something happened to her, very hard to describe, but unquestionably evident. However much her feelings for me might have changed, I had never been able to believe the same could happen to mine. She was released from hospital and advised to keep to her bed at Notley as much as possible for a time. This she seemed quite willing to do. We used those old spots on her lung, tuberculosis, as cover. It was now mid-April, and apart from my foreign seasons at the St. James's, my own career seemed to have come to a halt, as well as hers. As 1951 called for some special effort, so by heaven did 1952, for this was coronation year in Britain, and that it should be the last of such for a very long time was everybody's prayer. For now we had a lovely young queen, the first to assume the throne for 100 years, Elizabeth and Victoria. They had all ruled over great periods in our country, and we all felt we had a gift of some special significance.